The ballroom was a sea of gold and white, filled with the kind of people who wore their wealth like armor. I sat alone at table 12, clutching a glass of water, feeling like an outsider at my own sister's wedding. I was the black sheep, the single mom who worked double shifts as a nurse just to keep my daughter, Lily, fed and happy. I could feel the judgmental stares, but I ignored them until a shadow fell over my table, a shadow that turned my blood to ice. It was Tyler, my ex-husband, looking smug in a tuxedo that cost more than my yearly rent. He didn't come to talk. He came to destroy. With a cold smirk, he slammed a thick stack of legal papers onto the table. When I asked him with a trembling voice what this was, he didn't blink. He told me flatly that it was a custody petition. He mocked my life, and telling me I was penniless and that Lily deserved a luxury life he could provide. He vowed that by next month, my daughter would be living in his mansion, far away from me. My heart shattered. I was desperate, looking around the room for a miracle, and that's when I saw him. Standing by the bar was Giovanni Fioraldi. He was like a god of death in a tailored charcoal suit, the undisputed king of the Chicago underground. Tyler laughed, telling me not even to dream of looking at a man like Fioraldi, saying a man like that wouldn't even step on my shadow. But something inside me snapped. I had nothing left to lose. I stood up, my legs shaking, and walked straight toward the man everyone feared. As I reached him, I grabbed his expensive sleeve, my voice a desperate whisper. I begged him to pretend he knew me for just 5 minutes, and to pretend I was his. The entire ballroom went silent. Tyler's jaw dropped. Giovanni didn't pull away. Instead, he pulled me flush against his chest, the scent of expensive cologne and tobacco wrapping around me like a shield. He looked down at me with those amber eyes and whispered that I was playing a dangerous game. He asked if I even knew who he was. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I knew he was the only one who could save my daughter. Without a word, Giovanni claimed me. He turned to the crowd, his arm firm around my waist, and his voice boomed through the hall. He called Tyler out, asking if he was discussing his fiancé's financial status. The room gasped. Tyler started stuttering, unable to believe a nurse could be with a man like this. No, but Giovanni silenced him with a chilling warning. He told Tyler that if he ever bothered me again, the only papers he'd be signing would be for his own funeral. As we began to dance, the world felt like it was spinning. But in my ear, Giovanni's voice was like ice. He told me that using his name wasn't free. He laid out the deal. His father's will required him to be married to inherit his empire. He offered me a contract, 1 year of living in his house as his wife, and in return, he'd make sure Tyler never touched my daughter again. He stopped dancing, looking deep into my soul, and asked if I was truly ready to sell my soul to a monster to save my child. I didn't hesitate. I looked at his dark, beautiful face and asked him one simple question. Where do I sign? The morning after the wedding felt like a fever dream. I found myself standing in front of a pair of towering iron gates that guarded the Fioraldi estate, a fortress of black stone and cold glass. As the gates groaned open, I clutched Lily's small hand tighter. She looked up at the massive mansion with wide, innocent eyes, calling it a castle. Little did she know, this castle was ruled by a man the rest of the world called a monster. As we entered the grand foyer, the clicking of my heels echoed against the marble. Giovanni was waiting for us, standing at the top of the staircase like a king surveying his kingdom. He didn't offer a warm welcome. Instead, He looked at his watch and told me coldly that I was exactly 3 minutes late. He led me into a private study, a room that smelled of old leather and expensive cigars. He pushed a leather-bound folder across the mahogany desk. The contract. It was simple, but suffocating. 1 year. I would attend every event at his side. I would live under his roof, and I would never leave without his permission. In return, his army of lawyers would crush Tyler's custody case, and his guards would ensure Lily's safety 24/7. When I asked him why he chose me, his eyes darkened. He leaned across the desk, his face inches from mine, and whispered that I was the only woman in that ballroom who looked like she had nothing left to lose. He said a desperate woman is the most loyal kind of partner. But then, the heavy atmosphere broke. Lily, who had been quiet, suddenly ran toward him, showing him a drawing she had made. I held my breath, waiting for him to snap at her. But instead, Giovanni's large, scarred hand reached out and gently took the paper. For a split second, the coldness in his amber eyes vanished. He looked at my daughter and told her, in a voice I hadn't heard before, that her dragon looked very fierce. Just as I began to feel a sliver of safety, the real world came crashing back. Giovanni's head of security rushed in, looking pale. He whispered something about Tyler and a Russian alliance. It turned out Tyler was more desperate than we thought. He had gone to Giovanni's rivals, the Volkov family, offering them insider information in exchange for getting Lily back. Giovanni's face transformed. The hero Lily saw vanished, replaced by the ruthless Mafia king. He stood up, his jaw tight, and told me that the game had just changed. Tyler wasn't just coming for Lily anymore. He was coming for the Fioraldi Empire. He walked over to the window, looking out at the dark horizon, and gave me a chilling warning. He said that from this moment on, I wasn't just his fake wife. I was a target. He turned to me, his gaze burning, and told me that if I wanted to keep my daughter, I had to stop being a nurse and start acting like a queen. Because in his world, the only thing more dangerous than a mafia king was the woman standing beside him. The peace of the mansion was shattered at 3 a.m. I was jolted awake by the sound of breaking glass and the rhythmic thud of the heavy boots on the stairs. My first instinct wasn't fear for myself. It was for Lily. I rushed to her room, catching her in my arms just as the door was kicked open by men in black masks. These weren't Tyler's lawyers. These were Volkov's soldiers. Before I could even scream, a deafening roar echoed through the hallway. Giovanni appeared, his shirt unbuttoned, a weapon in each hand, looking like the devil himself. He didn't hesitate. He told me in a low, terrifying voice to get into the panic room and not to come out until he opened the door. From inside the cold, steel walls of the panic room, I heard the sounds of a war zone. But the worst part was the silence that followed. When the door finally hissed open, Giovanni was standing there, blood dripping from a cut on his forehead. He didn't look at his wounds. He only looked at Lily. When he saw she was safe, his shoulders finally dropped. But then he showed me a phone he had recovered from one of the intruders. It was a message from Tyler. My ex-husband hadn't just helped them get in. He had sold Lily's school schedule and our location for a seat at the Russian table. That was the moment the contract died and something real took its place. Giovanni didn't just see me as a fake wife anymore. He saw me as his. He looked me in the eyes and promised that by sunrise, Tyler would realize that some lines should never be crossed. We drove to an old warehouse on the edge of the city. Giovanni told me to stay in the car, but I couldn't. I followed him into the shadows. Inside, and Tyler was cowering in a chair, surrounded by Giovanni's men. He looked pathetic, pleading for mercy, claiming he only wanted a better life for Lily. Giovanni didn't yell. He walked up to Tyler, leaned in close, and whispered that a real father protects his child. He doesn't use them as a bargaining chip with monsters. He then turned to me, offering me a choice. He said Tyler was mine to deal with. I walked up to the man I once loved, the man who tried to steal my soul. I didn't hit him. I just leaned in and told him that he was no longer a father, no longer a husband, and no longer a threat. I watched as Giovanni's lawyers handed him papers that didn't just give me custody. They stripped him of every cent and every right he ever had. But as we turned to leave, a sniper's red dot appeared on Giovanni's chest. The Russians weren't finished. Without thinking, I threw myself in front of him. A shot rang out, echoing through the empty warehouse like a thunderclap. I felt a sharp, searing pain in my shoulder before the world started to tilt. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was Giovanni catching me, his face twisted in a look of pure, unadulterated agony, and the sound of him screaming my name. The smell of antiseptic and the steady beep of a heart monitor were the first things that brought me back to reality. My shoulder throbbed with a dull ache, but my heart felt heavier. As I opened my eyes, the first thing I saw wasn't the hospital ceiling. It was Giovanni. He was sitting by my bed, his head in his hands, looking more vulnerable than a Mafia king should ever be. When he realized I was awake, he didn't say a word. He just took my hand and pressed it against his forehead. I felt a drop of water hit my palm. The man who ruled Chicago with an iron fist was crying. He told me that in all his years of war, no one had ever taken a bullet for him. He whispered that I was the bravest, most foolish woman he had ever met, and that he couldn't imagine a world where I didn't exist. The recovery was slow, but the mansion had changed. Yes, it was no longer a cold fortress. It was a home. Lily was always by my side, and surprisingly, so was Giovanni. I watched him teach her how to play chess, his giant, scarred hands moving the pieces with such gentleness, it made my breath hitch. The 1-year contract was still sitting in his study, but neither of us mentioned it. We were living a lie that had somehow become the most honest thing in our lives. But the day finally came, the anniversary of the wedding. The contract was officially over. I stood in the grand foyer with my bags packed, waiting for him to tell me I was free to go. Tyler was gone, ruined and forgotten. Lily was safe. My debt was paid. Giovanni walked down the stairs, but he wasn't carrying my passport or a final check. He was holding a small velvet box. He led me to the same ballroom where this journey had begun, now empty and lit by 1,000 candles. He told me that the contract was dead, and he didn't want a fake wife anymore. He dropped to one knee, not as a king, but as a man. He told me that I had saved him from the darkness of his own world. He asked me to stay, not for protection or for a deal, but because he couldn't breathe without his queen. He looked at Lily, who was peeking from behind a pillar, and then back at me, promising to spend the rest of his life making sure no shadow ever touched us again. I didn't just say yes. I felt the weight of my old life, the fear, the struggle, the loneliness, finally lift. A year ago, I was a nurse sitting alone at table 12, mocked and broken. Today, I was standing in the arms of the most powerful man in the city. As we stepped out onto the balcony, overlooking the lights of Chicago. Giovanni wrapped his coat around my shoulders. I wasn't just Jessica the nurse anymore. I was the woman who had tamed a monster and built an empire out of a single dance. I looked at my reflection in the glass and smiled. The black sheep was gone. The Mafia queen had finally taken her throne.